For 3 years, the man who lived across the street had never once looked at her for longer than a heartbeat. Victoria Blake was the kind of woman entire boardrooms fell silent for, a chief executive whose name appeared in business magazines and whose signature could move buildings from blueprints into skylines. Yet in her own quiet neighborhood, she was nothing more than the woman across from the man who barely said good morning. Ethan Carter was that man, a widower who had folded his life into something small and careful, and neither of them could have guessed that a wedding at a lakeside resort in late autumn would be the place where 3 years of silence finally broke. When Victoria rose from her seat in the middle of the reception, when she looked straight at him and called out his name loud enough for 200 guests to hear, the entire room went still, because nobody in that hall understood why a woman known for her composure was seconds from crying in front of a man who had spent 3 years pretending not to see her. What came next, in the space of only a few minutes, would unravel a secret Victoria had carried since the very first week she moved into that house. And it would change the shape of that wedding, and both of their lives, forever. The invitation arrived on a Tuesday, tucked between a utility bill and a catalog Ethan never remembered ordering, and he stood in his kitchen for a long moment, simply looking at his own name, written in someone else's careful cursive. Ryan and Emily's wedding, it said, and underneath, a date in late November, and an address for a resort 3 hours north, beside a lake that turned silver when the light hit it right. Ethan had known Ryan since college, back when both of them still believed their lives would look a certain way, and some part of him wanted to close the envelope and set it on the counter and let the weeks slide by until the invitation quietly became a memory of an event he had missed. He mentioned it once to a friend at the hardware store, and the friend had laughed, not unkindly, and said everyone would understand if Ethan skipped it, because nobody expected the quiet widower to sit through another couple's happiest day. But Ethan kept thinking about the promise he had made Ryan years earlier, half joking, half serious, that whichever of them married first, the other would be there no matter what. A promise made in a dorm room at 22 did not feel like something a man could simply set aside at 39. So he circled the date on his calendar and told himself he would go, sit quietly, offer his congratulations, and leave before the dancing started. His days, in the meantime, had settled into a rhythm so steady it barely felt like living. Though Ethan had come to prefer it that way, he ran a small furniture and interior design workshop 2 streets from his house. The kind of business that survived on word of mouth and careful craftsmanship rather than advertising, and most evenings he came home to a quiet house, cooked something simple, and read until the light outside had gone completely dark. Directly across the street lived Victoria Blake. And for 3 years their entire relationship had consisted of nods exchanged while retrieving mail, the occasional wave when their cars passed on the narrow road, and nothing more substantial than that. Victoria left before sunrise most mornings, in a car that gleamed like it had never seen a pothole, and she returned well after dark, her porch light the only sign that someone still lived there at all. Ethan had gathered, mostly from a neighbor's gossip, that she ran a real estate development company, one large enough that her name occasionally appeared in the business section of the newspaper he no longer subscribed to. He had decided long ago that people like her existed in a different orbit entirely, one that never intersected with a man who fixed cabinet hinges for a living, and he had made peace with that distance without ever really examining why it comforted him to keep it. What Ethan did not know, what he could not have known from his side of the street, was that Victoria watched him more than she would ever have admitted to anyone. She noticed the way he carried his own groceries in from his car every Saturday morning, never rushing, always pausing to check on the elderly woman's mailbox 2 houses down. She noticed the light in his workshop window, staying on long after most reasonable people had gone to bed. And she noticed, more than anything, how a man who could clearly afford more chose to live so plainly, without any of the noise most successful men surrounded themselves with. Victoria's own life was built from noise, from meetings that ran past midnight, and phones that never fully stopped ringing, and there was something about Ethan's quiet that pulled at a part of her she rarely let herself feel. She told herself it was simple curiosity, the kind anyone might have about a neighbor who kept to himself, but some nights, standing at her window with a glass of wine going warm in her hand, she wondered what it might feel like to be looked at the way he seemed to look at everyone else, gently, and without any agenda at all. It was Emily, the bride, who mentioned the guest list to Ryan one evening while they finalized seating charts. And Ryan had laughed and said of course Victoria Blake would be there, since Emily's cousin had done business with her firm for years and the two women had grown genuinely close over the past several seasons. Neither Ryan nor Emily thought much of it beyond a passing comment about how impressive it was to have someone of her stature attending their small lakeside wedding, and neither of them had any idea that the name sitting 2 lines below hers on the same printed page belonged to a man who lived directly across the street from her. It was simply a coincidence. The kind small towns and small circles produce more often than anyone expects, but coincidences have a way of becoming turning points once 2 people are placed in the same room with nowhere else to look, somewhere in a house 2 streets over. Ethan set his own invitation on the counter, unaware that the woman he had spent 3 years politely avoiding would be sitting only a few tables away from him, dressed for an occasion neither of them had chosen, but both of them would remember for the rest of their lives. The resort sat at the edge of the lake like something built for a postcard, its windows catching the last gold light of a November afternoon before the sky deepened into the kind of blue that only comes right before evening. Ethan arrived wearing a suit that had hung in his closet for years, slightly out of fashion but pressed carefully the night before, and he found his seat near the back of the reception hall, without drawing much attention to himself. Around him, couples moved in pairs, laughing, adjusting each other's ties and straightening each other's dresses, and Ethan noticed, the way he always noticed at these events, how completely alone he looked, sitting there with an empty chair on either side of him. He had grown used to it over the years, had trained himself not to feel the weight of it too heavily, but there was still a small ache that settled in his chest every time a room full of couples reminded him what he no longer had. He watched Ryan at the altar, watched Emily walk down an aisle scattered with white petals, and for a moment he allowed himself to simply be happy for his old friend, without letting any of his own history creep into it. Victoria arrived precisely on time, the way she arrived at everything, dressed in a deep green gown that made the room quietly shift its attention toward the door the moment she walked through it. Heads turned, the way they always did when she entered a space, and several people leaned toward each other to murmur her name. The CEO everyone had read about, but few had actually met in person. She smiled the practiced smile she used for these situations, warm enough to seem genuine, controlled enough to reveal nothing. And she made her way toward the seating chart to find her assigned table. When she found her name, she also found, printed just below it in the same careful font, a name she recognized immediately, and for a brief second, her composure cracked into something closer to surprise. She had not expected to see Ethan Carter's name on a wedding guest list 3 hours from their street, had not expected the universe to place them at the same table, with the same centerpiece between them. And she felt something flutter in her chest that she quickly attributed to simple nerves about the ceremony itself. The seating arrangement placed them side by side, an accident of alphabetical order, or perhaps something gentler that neither of them could name. And when Victoria lowered herself into the chair beside Ethan's, the air between them turned briefly awkward in a way 3 years of hallway nods had never quite produced. Ethan offered a polite hello, the same tone he used for anyone he barely knew, and Victoria answered in kind, both of them suddenly aware of how strange it felt to sit shoulder to shoulder after years of only waving from opposite sides of a street. The ceremony began before either of them had to figure out what to say next, and for a while they simply watched Ryan and Emily exchange vows, the kind of promises that made half the room reach for tissues and the other half smile at memories of their own weddings. When the ceremony ended and the guests moved into easier conversation while the tables were reset for dinner, Victoria turned toward Ethan and asked, mostly to fill the silence, how exactly he knew the groom. Ethan told her about college, about the promise made in a cramped dorm room, and something in the way he told it, unhurried, self-deprecating, made Victoria laugh for the first time in what felt like weeks. She asked more questions after that, about his workshop, about the kind of furniture he built, and he found himself answering more openly than he usually did with strangers, perhaps because there was something in her attention that felt less like small talk and more like genuine interest. Victoria mentioned lightly, that she ran a real estate firm, and Ethan admitted he already knew that most of the neighborhood knew that, and for a moment, they both smiled at how absurd it was that they had lived across from each other for 3 years, only to have their first real conversation happen at someone else's wedding. By the time dinner was served, Victoria had laughed twice more, easily, without the careful control she usually kept around her laughter, and she caught herself thinking that the man beside her bore almost no resemblance to the image she had built of him from a distance. She had imagined him as simply reserved, perhaps even a little cold. A man who kept himself apart from the world by choice rather than necessity. But sitting beside him, she found instead someone thoughtful, someone who listened more than he spoke, and who seemed genuinely curious about her answers, rather than waiting for his turn to talk about himself. It unsettled her slightly. This gap between the neighbor she thought she knew and the man actually sitting beside her, and she found herself wondering what else she had gotten wrong about him over 3 years of watching from a window. Ethan, for his part, noticed none of the calculation people usually attributed to powerful executives. Only a woman who asked good questions and who seemed, underneath the polish, a little tired in a way that had nothing to do with the wedding itself. Neither of them said anything about it. But something had shifted quietly between them by the time the plates were cleared. Something small enough to ignore, and significant enough that both of them noticed it anyway. After dinner, the band began to play, and the dance floor filled quickly with couples who had been waiting all evening for exactly this moment, and Victoria watched 3 different men approach her table to ask if she might like to dance. She declined each one politely, offering the same practiced excuse about her feet aching in her heels, though the truth was simpler and harder to explain, that she had no interest in dancing with anyone whose name she would forget by morning. Ethan, sensing the evening winding down for him personally, decided quietly to slip away toward the balcony that overlooked the lake, wanting a few minutes of cold air before he made his excuses and drove the 3 hours home. He had barely settled against the railing, watching the moonlight scatter across the water, when he heard the balcony door open behind him and turned to find Victoria stepping out to join him, her heels held loosely in one hand. She came to stand beside him without asking permission. The way people do when they have decided something is worth the risk of rejection. And for a moment, neither of them said anything at all, letting the cold air and the sound of the band drifting faintly through the glass fill the silence instead. It was Victoria who finally spoke, her voice quieter than the one she used in board meetings, and she asked him plainly why he always avoided her, why 3 years of living across the street had produced nothing more than nods and half-finished sentences. Ethan considered the question longer than she expected, long enough that she thought perhaps he wouldn't answer at all. And when he did, his response was gentle, but firm, that people like her and people like him simply moved through different worlds, and it seemed easier for everyone if he kept himself in his own lane. He said it kindly, without any bitterness in his voice, but Victoria felt something in her chest tighten anyway. Because it was the first time in longer than she could remember that someone had looked directly at the distance between them and chosen it deliberately. She did not argue with him, did not try to convince him he was wrong, because some part of her understood there was more beneath his answer than he was willing to share on a cold balcony at someone else's wedding. Instead, she simply nodded, said something polite about the view, and excused herself back inside before her expression could betray how much his words had stung. Walking back through the crowd of dancing couples, Victoria felt, for perhaps the first time in her adult life, the particular sting of being turned away by someone she had not even realized she wanted to be closer to, until the moment he made it clear he did not want the same thing. She smiled through the rest of the evening, congratulated Ryan and Emily with real warmth, and drove home in silence, with the radio off, turning Ethan's words over in her mind, long after the resort had disappeared in her rearview mirror. Somewhere in that quiet drive, a decision began forming in her, not fully shaped yet, but certain enough that she knew she was no longer content to simply watch him from across the street and accept whatever distance he chose to keep between them. The weeks after the wedding settled back into their old rhythm on the surface, Ethan rising early for the workshop, Victoria leaving before dawn for meetings that stretched into evenings. both of them exchanging the same polite nods whenever their schedules happened to overlap on the street between their houses. But something had changed in the quiet architecture of Victoria's attention, because now, when she caught herself glancing toward his house from her window, she no longer told herself it was simple curiosity. She began noticing details she had somehow missed before. The way Ethan carried his own trash bins to the curb every week without being asked. The way he shoveled not only his own walkway after the first snow, but the walkway of the elderly widow, 2 houses down as well. One Saturday morning, she watched him kneel beside a teenage neighbor's bicycle, patiently working a rusted chain back into place. Refusing the folded bill, the boy's mother tried to press into his hand afterward. Victoria mentioned this, eventually, to an older neighbor she occasionally spoke with while walking her dog around the block, a woman named Margaret, who had lived on the street longer than anyone else and seemed to know everyone's business without ever appearing nosy about it. Margaret laughed softly when Victoria asked about Ethan and said simply that the man had helped half the neighborhood at one point or another, fixing porch steps, hauling furniture, checking in on the older residents during storms, never once accepting so much as a cup of coffee in return. "He does it quietly," Margaret said, "like he doesn't want anyone to notice," and Victoria found herself thinking about that phrase for days afterward, the idea of a man doing good so deliberately without wanting credit for any of it. It did not match the image most people carried of successful men, the ones Victoria dealt with daily in boardrooms who wanted their generosity announced before it was even finished being generous. And something about Ethan's quiet insistence on invisibility made her curiosity deepen into something that felt more like admiration. It was Margaret, in the same conversation, who mentioned almost as an afterthought that Ethan had once been something of a name in architecture circles, before life had apparently rearranged his priorities entirely. Victoria pressed gently for more, and Margaret, perhaps sensing the question mattered more than casual gossip usually did, told her that Ethan had designed buildings once, real buildings, the kind that got photographed and written about, before he seemed to simply disappear from that world years ago and reappear running a small workshop that most people assumed was all he had ever done. Victoria found herself unable to stop thinking about the gap in that story. The space between the architect who once made headlines and the man who quietly shoveled his neighbor's walkways without wanting thanks. She went home that evening and, against her better judgment, searched his name online and found exactly what Margaret had described, a handful of old articles praising a rising architect named Ethan Carter. And then nothing at all. As though the man had simply vanished from public record the moment he stepped away from that life. The silence in those search results told her more than any article could have. And Victoria sat with her laptop open long after she should have gone to bed, wondering what exactly had happened to make a man walk away from a career he had clearly been gifted at, choosing instead a life so deliberately small it barely left a trace anywhere online. She thought about their conversation on the balcony, about the way he had said people like her and people like him simply moved through different worlds, and she began to suspect that his words had less to do with class or money than she had first assumed. There was a wound somewhere in that gap of years. She was certain of it. The kind of wound that made a man retreat rather than climb. And Victoria found herself wanting, more than she had wanted almost anything in years, to understand what had put it there. She closed her laptop that night with a strange new tenderness settling over her curiosity. The beginning of something gentler than admiration, though she would not yet let herself name it. The truth, when Victoria finally learned it weeks later, came not from searching, but from a quiet conversation with Ryan, who mentioned it carefully one afternoon when Victoria called to thank him again for the wedding and ended up asking, almost too casually, about his old college friend. Ryan hesitated before answering. The way people hesitate before handing someone else's grief to a stranger. But something in Victoria's tone must have convinced him it mattered. And he told her, gently, that Ethan had once been married to a woman named Claire, a marriage everyone who knew them described as effortless, the kind of partnership that made other couples quietly envious. They had built a life together while Ethan's career rose, Ryan said, and everything had seemed to be exactly the way it was supposed to be right up until Claire was diagnosed with an illness that took her from him within less than 2 years. Ethan had stopped designing buildings almost immediately after her death, Ryan explained. Not because anyone asked him to, but because he simply couldn't find any reason to keep building things meant to outlast people when the person he loved most hadn't been given the chance to. Victoria sat with the phone pressed to her ear long after Ryan finished speaking, feeling something in her chest ache, in a way she hadn't expected from a story about a man she had known only distantly for 3 years. She understood now why he had built his life so small, so quiet, so carefully arranged to avoid ever risking that kind of loss again, because a man who had watched something so complete disappear would naturally build walls high enough to keep anything else from getting close enough to matter. It explained the balcony conversation entirely. The gentle firmness in his voice when he said people like them belong to different worlds, because the real difference wasn't wealth or status at all, it was that Victoria still had a whole life ahead of her to risk, while Ethan had already spent his risk once and lost everything on the other side of it. Something in Victoria softened permanently that afternoon, the sharp edges of her earlier hurt dissolving into something closer to tenderness, and by the time she hung up the phone, she understood with unsettling clarity that whatever she felt for the man across the street had grown into something far more serious than curiosity. She did not rush toward him after that, understanding instinctively that a man who had built his solitude so carefully would only retreat further if she pushed too hard against it. So instead, Victoria began creating small, ordinary reasons for their paths to cross more often than coincidence alone would allow. She started walking her dog at the exact hour she knew he usually returned from the workshop, timing it carefully enough that it never felt engineered, and she began stopping to chat for a few minutes longer each time, asking about his day, listening more than she spoke. One evening, she knocked on his door holding 2 cups of coffee, claiming she had bought too many by mistake and didn't want to waste one. And Ethan, though he clearly suspected the excuse was thinner than she intended it to seem, invited her to sit on his porch steps anyway. Their conversations grew longer over the following weeks, easier, filled with the kind of comfortable silences that only happen between people who have stopped performing for each other. Victoria found other reasons too, asking Ethan once if he might look over a set of renovation sketches for a building her company was restoring, claiming she trusted his eye more than the architect's on her own payroll, which was not entirely a lie. Ethan spread the drawings across his workshop table and spent nearly 2 hours walking her through structural details she genuinely hadn't considered. And for the first time in years, something in his voice carried the old excitement Ryan had once described to her, the enthusiasm of a man who used to build things he believed in. She noticed it immediately, the way his hands moved more freely over the paper, the way his sentences grew longer and more animated, and she said nothing about it out loud, but she carried the memory of that evening with her for days afterward like something precious she didn't want to disturb. Ethan began smiling more easily around her too, laughing at things that wouldn't have earned more than a polite nod months earlier, and their neighbors began to notice, the way small towns always notice, the way Margaret mentioned once with a knowing smile, that the two of them seemed to be spending an awful lot of time together for people who barely spoke a year ago. There were quieter moments too, ones neither of them mentioned to anyone else. Evenings when Victoria arrived at his door with takeout instead of coffee, claiming again that she had ordered too much by mistake, and Ethan had stopped pretending to believe the excuse weeks earlier, simply pulling out a second chair and letting her sit. They talked about small things mostly, the kind of ordinary conversation that mattered more than either of them expected. Favorite books, childhood towns, the strange comfort of rain against a window while something simmered on the stove. Ethan found himself telling her, in pieces over several evenings, about Claire, not as a wound he needed to protect, but as a life he had once lived and still carried with tenderness, and Victoria listened without flinching, without trying to compete with a memory that clearly deserved its place. It struck her, more than once, that his willingness to speak Claire's name aloud in front of her was its own kind of trust. The sort that couldn't be rushed or requested, only offered freely once someone finally felt safe enough to give it. Even Victoria's closest friends noticed the change in her, commenting that she seemed lighter somehow, less consumed by the endless churn of meetings and mergers that had defined her for years, and when they asked why, She found herself unwilling to say his name out loud, as though speaking it too soon might scare away something still fragile and new. But for all the ground they had covered, Ethan still hesitated at the edges of whatever this was becoming, still pulled back gently whenever a conversation drifted too close to anything resembling more than friendship. And Victoria began to understand that whenever a conversation wasn't about her at all, it was about the fear of losing something again the moment he let himself want it. She could see it in the way his eyes would soften and then quickly look away, in the way he would say goodnight a little too formally after an evening that had felt anything but formal, and she realized that if she waited for him to take the first real step, she might be waiting for the rest of her life. Something in her, the same decisiveness that had built an empire out of instinct and nerve, began quietly deciding that she would have to be the one brave enough to close the remaining distance between them. The opportunity arrived sooner than she expected, when Ryan and Emily hosted a small gathering weeks after their wedding to thank the friends and family who had made the day possible. A modest evening at their home filled with familiar faces and easy conversation, rather than the formality of the reception itself. Ethan attended out of loyalty to his old friend, standing near the edge of the room the way he always did. And Victoria watched him from across the space, noticing the moment he began glancing toward the door, clearly preparing to slip away quietly, the way he usually did at gatherings that ran too long for his comfort. Something in her chest tightened at the sight of him retreating again, at the familiar pattern of a man who always positioned himself at the margins of every room he entered. And Victoria understood, with sudden and complete clarity, that if she let him walk out that door without saying anything, they would simply return to their old rhythm of nods and half-sentences, 3 more years of watching each other from opposite sides of a street. She set down her glass, walked past several people mid-conversation without excusing herself, and did the one thing she had never allowed herself to do in front of an audience. She let her guard fall completely and made herself impossible to ignore. Victoria stood in the middle of the room, raised her voice enough to cut through the low hum of conversation around her, and called his name so clearly that every head in the room turned toward her instead of him. "Ethan, look at me." The words landed heavier than she intended, and the room fell into a silence so complete that even the music playing softly in the background seemed to fade beneath it. Ethan froze near the doorway, one hand still resting against the frame, his expression caught somewhere between confusion and something closer to fear. Because in 3 years he had never once seen Victoria Blake lose her composure in front of anyone, let alone in front of a room full of people who would certainly talk about it long after the evening ended. She walked toward him slowly, deliberately, her heels sounding against the hardwood floor in the otherwise silent room. And when she finally stood close enough that he could see the emotion gathering in her eyes, she said the words that had been building in her for months. 3 years, Ethan, she said, her voice steady despite the tears threatening at the edges of it. 3 years, and you have never once really looked at me. The room around them seemed to hold its breath collectively. Ryan and Emily exchanging a startled glance from near the kitchen doorway, several guests setting down their drinks entirely to watch what was clearly not a moment meant for casual observation, but one none of them could look away from either. Ethan opened his mouth to respond, though no words came immediately, because the weight of what she had just said, and the courage it had taken to say it in front of an entire room, had temporarily stripped him of his usual careful composure. Victoria did not wait for him to recover his footing, understanding that if she stopped now, the moment would slip away the same way every other opportunity between them always had. Quietly, politely, without either of them ever saying the thing that actually mattered, she told him, then, standing in front of everyone with no attempt left to disguise what she felt, that she needed him to understand something she had carried since the very week she moved onto their street 3 years earlier. It was the first week in her new house, she said, boxes still stacked in every room, when her car had died in the driveway on a morning she had an investor meeting she could not afford to miss. She had stood there panicking in the cold, a stranger in a neighborhood she barely knew, when a quiet man from across the street had simply walked over without being asked, opened her hood, and had the engine running again in under 20 minutes, refusing even to give his name before disappearing back inside his own house. That winter, she continued, her voice thickening with emotion she no longer bothered to hide. Her walkway had been shoveled every single snowfall before she ever woke up to do it herself, and she had eventually realized it was always him, always quiet, always gone before she could catch him to say thank you. There had been a week, she went on, when a shipment of heavy furniture arrived for her new office, and the delivery company had simply left everything on her porch, far too heavy for her to move alone, and by the time she came home exhausted from work, every box had already been carried inside and arranged neatly against her living room wall, with no note, no explanation, nothing except the quiet certainty of who must have done it. "Ethan," she said, looking directly into his eyes now, "you have spent 3 years taking care of me without ever once wanting me to notice, and I have spent 3 years wanting nothing more than the chance to actually see you back." "It was not admiration that grew in me first," she told him. "And it was not curiosity either, though both of those came later once I finally understood who you really were beneath the distance you kept. It was watching a man choose kindness again and again, with absolutely nothing to gain from it, and slowly realizing that kind of quiet decency was rarer than anything I had ever encountered in a lifetime of boardrooms and transactions." Ethan stood completely still through all of it, his expression shifting from shock into something raw and unguarded that none of his neighbors had ever seen on him before, because the small kindnesses Victoria described had felt, at the time he performed them, like nothing worth remembering, simple decency extended to someone who happened to live nearby. He had never imagined those quiet gestures had been witnessed so closely, had never imagined they had planted something in her that grew steadily across 3 years, while he remained convinced their lives existed in entirely separate orbits. Something in his chest cracked open at the realization that the distance he had so carefully maintained had never actually been distance at all from her side, that she had been watching him with the kind of attention he had spent years convincing himself he no longer deserved from anyone. The room stayed silent around them, guests forgetting entirely to pretend they weren't listening, because everyone present understood they were watching something far too honest to interrupt. Ethan finally found his voice, though it came out quieter than he intended, admitting that he had always known, on some level, that Victoria paid him more attention than a passing neighbor should, but he had told himself repeatedly that it meant nothing, that women like her did not end up caring for men like him in any way that mattered. He told her, haltingly, that after Claire died he had made a private decision never to let anyone matter to him again in that particular way, because the pain of losing someone so completely had convinced him that loving anyone else would only be setting himself up for the same devastation twice. It was not that he didn't see her, he admitted, his voice breaking slightly on the words. It was that he saw her too clearly, saw exactly what he could lose if he let himself want her the way some quiet part of him had wanted her since the very first year she moved in. Victoria reached forward then and took his hand in both of hers, not caring anymore who watched, and told him gently that she would never try to replace what he had lost, that Claire would always belong to a part of his life that was entirely her own and untouchable. "But I am asking you," she said, "to consider writing the next part of your story instead of simply guarding what's left of the last one, because I don't want to replace anything. Ethan, I only want to build something new beside you." The room seemed to exhale collectively at those words. Several guests wiping at their eyes without embarrassment, Emily pressing a hand against her chest near the kitchen doorway, Ryan smiling at his old friend, with the particular pride of someone who had waited a long time to see him look truly alive again. Ethan looked down at her hands wrapped around his, looked up at her face still wet with tears she no longer tried to hide, and felt something inside him that had been closed for years finally begin, slowly and carefully, to open. He pulled her into an embrace right there in the middle of the room, and the small crowd around them broke into applause, quiet at first and then warmer. The sound of people who understood they had just witnessed something rare enough to remember for years. In the weeks that followed, Ethan made a decision that surprised even himself, one he had been circling for months without admitting it out loud, and he told Victoria one evening on his porch that he intended to sell the house he had lived in since Claire's passing, the house that still held her presence in every corner, despite years of trying to simply live around the memory of her, instead of through it. Victoria did not push him toward the decision, understanding it had to belong entirely to him, but she sat beside him quietly while he explained that he wanted a fresh space, not to erase what had come before, but to finally build something that belonged to the life he was choosing now, rather than the one grief had shaped for so long. Together, over the following months, they found a modest piece of land not far from their old street, close enough that Margaret and the rest of their neighbors could still walk over for coffee, and Ethan began designing a house unlike anything he had built in years, drawing plans late into the night with an energy Victoria had not seen in him before. Victoria found herself changing too, in ways she hadn't expected when she first set out simply to make a quiet man notice her. She began leaving the office earlier, delegating more of the endless meetings to her capable team, discovering that the empire she had built could survive perfectly well without her presence at every single decision that crossed her desk. She started spending Saturday mornings in Ethan's workshop instead of her office, learning to sand wood and read blueprints, finding a kind of peace in the slow, deliberate work that her fast-moving career had never offered her. Ethan, in turn, returned properly to architecture, taking on small residential projects at first, cautious and uncertain, until the confidence Ryan had once described in him began resurfacing project by project, client by client, each completed design chipping away at the years he had spent, believing that part of himself had died along with Claire. Together, they decided to build something larger than just their own house, establishing a modest fund that renovated homes for elderly residents living alone on limited means, the kind of quiet, unglamorous work that never made headlines but changed the daily lives of people who needed it most. Ethan designed the renovations personally, drawing on years of skill that had sat dormant far too long, while Victoria used her company's resources and connections to fund the materials and labor without ever attaching her name to the credit for it, the same way Ethan had once helped an entire neighborhood without wanting a single word of thanks. It felt, to both of them, like the truest possible expression of everything that had brought them together in the first place, a shared belief that the best kindnesses were the ones nobody needed to know about, done simply because the doing of them mattered more than being seen doing them. Ryan and Emily visited the new house on the day it was finally finished, walking through rooms still smelling faintly of fresh paint and sawdust, admiring the way morning light fell across the living room, exactly where Ethan had designed the windows to catch it. Ryan clapped his old friend on the shoulder and said he had never seen him look so much like the man he remembered from college, before everything happened, before the years of quiet retreat, and Ethan simply smiled and said that some things, it turned out, were worth waiting a long time to find again. Victoria stood in the doorway watching the two friends talk, feeling a warmth settle over her that had nothing to do with the fireplace crackling behind her. And when Ethan turned to find her standing there, he crossed the room and took her hand without saying anything at all, because some feelings had grown too large and too certain to need words attached to them anymore. Later that evening, as the light outside softened into the particular blue of early winter dusk, Ethan looked at Victoria across their new kitchen, boxes still half unpacked around them, and said quietly that he had spent years believing the thing he had lost could never be replaced by anything. And he had been right about that, because nothing ever would replace it. But what he had found instead, he told her, was something he hadn't known he was still capable of finding, something that had been standing across the street from him the entire time. He convinced himself he had nothing left worth offering anyone. It turns out, he said, smiling in the soft way she had come to love more than almost anything else about him, that what I spent years searching for without even realizing I was searching was living directly across from me the entire time, waiting for me to finally look up. They held a small gathering not long after, nothing extravagant, nothing designed to impress anyone. Just their closest neighbors gathered in the new house with simple food and warm conversation, the same people who had watched their story unfold in quiet increments over years of nods and coffee cups and shoveled walkways. Margaret raised a modest toast, joking that she had known something was coming long before either of them admitted it to themselves. And the small crowd laughed warmly, the kind of laughter that comes easily among people who genuinely care for one another. As the evening wound down and guests began drifting toward the door with quiet thanks and warm hugs, Ethan and Victoria stood together on the porch of their new home, looking back across the years at everything that had brought them there, two people who had once lived facing each other across a quiet street, now standing together inside a home neither of them could have built alone. The story that had begun with 3 years of silence and a single moment of courage at a wedding reception ended not with grand gestures or dramatic declarations, but with something quieter and far more lasting. Two people who had finally learned to truly see each other, choosing at last to walk forward together into whatever came next.